everyone, Milton here to talk about aspect techniques for Dire Avengers. Now in the previous video, if you check it out on the playlist, we talked about the faction rule, aspect techniques for Blades of Khaine. I don't want to tread too much of the same ground over and over again, so check out that video if you're not familiar with how aspect techniques work. Just the shortest version here. If you have any Dire Avengers on your team, you can use the Dire Avenger aspect techniques for those models. You can use each technique once per turning point. You can use one technique in a given activation or counteraction. And what this means is that you could potentially have a single aspect warrior use one technique on their activation, a different one on a retaliation attack roll, a different one in a counteraction, all inside the same turning point, as long as they're different techniques. If you're playing all Dire Avengers, you can use each of those 5 techniques up to twice in a turning point. So, Dire Avengers are armed with rending shuriken catapults that deal 3-4 damage, and they have fists. Their fists are actually better than most models in the game with a fist profile, but they're really here for ranged support and to hold objectives while your melee operatives head out to spread the good word about Khaine. One thing worth noting is that each of the 5 techniques for Dire Avengers, of the 5 techniques for Dire Avengers, 3 are all about performing shoot actions with shuriken weapons specifically, and 1 is about defending against shooting attacks. So, if you bring a Dire Avenger Exarch with the Shimmer Shield and a melee weapon, that model will be unable to use most of the aspect techniques since it does not have a shuriken weapon. It may still be worth it if you're playing all Dire Avengers into certain matchups, but it's important to keep in mind the restrictions on each technique when you go to use them. So, let's take a look at the 5 aspect techniques for Dire Avengers and how they generally play out during a game. The first of the techniques is the Slicing Hurricane. I'm just going to read through the text of it, and then we'll break things down a little bit. Use this aspect technique when a friendly Dire Avenger operative is performing the reposition action. That operative can perform the shoot action during that action. It must do so in a location it can be placed, and any remaining move distance it had from that reposition action can be used after it does so. You must select its shuriken catapult, shuriken pistol, or twin shuriken catapult for that shoot action. So, you must use it during a reposition action. You must use shuriken weapons for the shooting attack. And the shooting attack will still cost you an APL. I know that's a question that you see occasionally from folks that are new to Blades of Khaine or some other teams that have a similar ability. You do still have to spend the APL for the shooting action. Now, there is a recent FAQ that said that you can perform 2 shoot actions during 1 move action when using the Slicing Hurricane. So a Dire Avenger Exarch, for example, or a Dire Avenger using the Starfall Firefight ploy can potentially spend 1 APL to move, and during that make 2 different shoot actions using up its 3 APL that it has access to. Now, Dire Avengers are already APL 3, so you normally already have the option to reposition, shoot, and then dash. And oftentimes you'll use that to say, move to get a line on something, shoot, and then dash back into, to where you're no longer visible or where you're obscured so that your model is pretty safe. So, because you already have that sort of mobility, you oftentimes won't find yourself using the Slicing Hurricane to make a single shot, unless you're already using your 3rd APL for something like a mission action to plant beacons, or later in the game if they're running onto a point to try and tap the last point for the loot crit op or something like that. One thing that's also interesting here is that you can potentially use this in combination with the ladder equipment to have a really short climb up to something, shoot, and then go back down and back behind cover with 1 APL. So it's pretty flexible. It is interesting, and it is something that you will find yourself using, especially if you're running multiple Dire Avengers. But it's probably not the go-to that you're gonna want to prioritize using most, because there are some options that'll give you a little bit more damage out of your Dire Avengers. Excuse me. So, the second aspect technique, Death of 1,000 Blades. Use this aspect technique when a friendly Dire Avenger operative is performing the shoot action and you select a Shuriken Catapult or Twin Shuriken Catapult. Until the end of that action, that weapon has the Torrent 2 weapon rule, but you cannot select more than one secondary target. So things to note here. Again, it must be a shooting action, and this one's actually a little bit more restrictive because it does say Shuriken Catapult or Twin Shuriken Catapult, so the Exarch with a Shuriken Pistol cannot use Death of 1,000 Blades. You get the Torrent 2 rule, like it says, and you pick one secondary target. It is important to remember that that secondary target must still be a valid shooting target for Torrent, and then you make your 2 attack rolls. So this one's pretty straightforward. You get to essentially shoot 2 targets with one shooting action, and against certain teams like Brood Brothers or Death Corps of Krieg, where they've got a whole bunch of operatives, it's going to be harder for them to hide them all, and they're only 7 wounds with 5-up saves. This can potentially kill 2 things with a single shoot action. Against anything tougher than the lightest targets in the game, however, it's unlikely to net you multiple kills. It will definitely deal some damage to both models, but it's not likely to kill several things, so you probably don't want to count on this to get you multiple kills for, say, the champion tack-up, for example. This is, however, one of the Dire Avenger techniques that you will probably end up using most, and that's because most tournaments right now, and a lot of just local play groups, even for casual play, are predominantly using some combination of Into the Dark and Volcus terrain. And on Into the Dark boards, or inside the strongholds on Volcus, anything that uses the close quarters rules, essentially. Having Torrent gives you lethal 5-up on the damage, or the attack roll. Excuse me. Lethal 5-up on top of Rending, for all your Shuriken weapons, starts to do some real damage to almost any target you shoot at, since it's not unreasonable to end up with 2 crits in a hit, or 3 crits on an attack roll at that point. So most of the time, you'll end up using this technique to get the Torrent keyword more than to get that second shot. And, if you do get a chance to use the secondary target, that's a bonus. I have played some games on Into the Dark where somebody has to push into a room and you can get a Dire Avenger lined up and get, lethal 5-up Rending shots on multiple models, and that can really swing some games. It can be pretty nutty. But a lot of the time, this is basically just to give you lethal 5-up on a shot. And, it can turn a Dire Avenger into a pretty serious damage dealer if you're using the close quarter rules, or, like I said, to potentially soften up 2 lighter targets. And we'll talk a little bit more about lethal 5-up here, because the next technique is Vigilance of the Avenger. What Vigilance of the Avenger does is you use this aspect technique when a friendly Dire Avenger operative is performing the shoot action, and you select a Shuriken Catapult or Twin Shuriken Catapult. Until the end of that action, that weapon has the lethal 5-up weapon rule. Very straightforward. You just add lethal 5-up onto the weapon profile, and like I just said, lethal 5-up on top of Rending is pretty good. It's even better when you combine it with Ceaseless, and a Dire Avenger Exarch with the Twin Shuriken Catapults has Ceaseless innately. We also have the Khaine's Vengeance ploy to get Ceaseless on all of our shooting attacks that target an expended operative. So I use this a lot in any matchups into elites where they have fewer models. They're going to have to activate something first, and then I try to pile onto things they've already activated, throw as many shuriken shots at it as possible with Ceaseless. And you'd really be surprised by just how much damage this deals. I'm still getting better at editing videos. I'm going to cut here in a second, and then do a screen share, and we'll talk a little bit more about the math on Ceaseless, Rending, and lethal 5-up, and just how much damage you deal on average. But that's not the whole story. Because it's crits, your average damage is a useful thing to know, but the damage can be really swingy. It can spike really hard. It's not going to happen all the time, but sometimes with lethal 5-up and Rending and Ceaseless, you will just get 4 crits. And if your opponent doesn't roll a bunch of 6s on their defense dice, you might put through 12 or 16 damage on a model, and can just kill a Space Marine outright or cripple it with a single shooting action, which is pretty wild. And if you take enough shuriken shots, odds are one of them will spike damage, and then, you know, that's when you go in with your melee, right? So even though this is a Dire Avenger aspect technique, and it really is very specifically, you know, just there to increase the damage output of your shooting, chipping things down with your shooting is what enables your melee operatives to really shine, so it's important to keep that whole dynamic in mind. Alright, so I'm here on a kill team damage calculator because I wanted to give some numbers as far as just how much the lethal 5-up and ceaseless matter with our shooting. So on this side, situation 1, we've got an attacker firing a shuriken weapon, so 4 attacks hitting on 3s, 3-4 damage, with most common fail, so ceaseless, which is available either with the Dire Avenger Exarch with a Twin Shuriken Catapult, or through the strategic ploy, Khaine's Vengeance, against models that are expended. I use that ploy a lot. That's one of the things that we'll be talking about when we get into ploys and general play style in certain matchups, but I think it's worth keeping in mind. And then lethal 5-up, either from Vigilance of the Avenger or Death of 1,000 Cuts. So, when we have a lethal 5-up, ceaseless, rending, shuriken weapon shooting at a Space Marine, so 3-up save, 14 wounds, we're looking at an average damage of 7.71. Very low percent chance to kill them in a single shoot action, which makes total sense. But if we have 2 rounds of shooting, we're looking at an average damage of 15.42, with a 65.11% chance to kill Space Marines with 2 shots of lethal 5-up ceaseless shuriken fire. So, a Dire Avenger Exarch doing 2 shoot actions at a Space Marine with lethal 5-up. Well, I suppose he can't get lethal 5-up on both of them. Okay, let's backtrack. 7.1 plus 6.07. Good odds of killing a Space Marine just with that Dire Avenger Exarch. Over on the other side, what I've got here is a shuriken weapon with ceaseless shooting at a 7 wound 5-up save model. So here we're looking at Deathcore of Krieg or Blooded or Brood Brothers, those kind of guardsman type models. Without the lethal 5-up, we're looking at an average damage of 8.55 and a 70% chance to kill. So if we're into those matchups using the torrent off of a Dire Avenger, pretty good odds of taking out 2 models. If we go up to 8 wounds and a 4-up save, so we're looking at other elf teams, we're looking at an average of 7.29 damage, 49.68% chance to kill those models without the lethal 5-up. So, you know, a torrent shot may still be worthwhile here. If we add in the lethal 5-up, all of a sudden we're looking at 8.77 average damage and a 67.98% chance to kill. So a Dire Avenger with ceaseless and lethal 5-up into elf teams pretty reliably kills them. Even if it doesn't kill them in one shot, you're probably putting them very low so that almost anything else will finish them at that point. So I just wanted to give you a look at some of the math involved. I'm not a math person, so I find this to be a really useful tool just for figuring out roughly how much damage you do with various things. But I will go ahead and cut back to the rest of the video. So the 4th aspect technique for Dire Avengers is Unstinting Immovable. Unstinting Immovable is used when an operative is shooting a friendly Dire Avenger operative and you've rolled 2 or more fails. You can discard one of those failures to retain the other as a normal success instead. So, again, this one's really straightforward. It doesn't do anything fancy, but it helps keep your Dire Avengers alive. And because it's something that you use on your opponent's turn when they're shooting at you, if a Dire Avenger is being shot at and you rolled multiple failures, you should just automatically use this pretty much. This is actually one of the techniques that I often forget to use because, you know, I'm sure most other players do the same thing. We're spending our time thinking about our activations and like, okay, I've got 2 Dire Avengers and I want this one to go over here and use the lethal 5-up to try and take out this model, and then this one's gonna like move and dash onto the point and tap it and do some other thing. And then we just don't really think through all of the options available to us when an opponent starts rolling dice and you're in a tournament setting where maybe you have short time, you're trying to make decisions quickly. Excuse me. So keep it in mind, be better than me. Remember that this exists, because it can certainly help save your models a couple wounds, and with a low model count team of fairly squishy models, that can make the difference between your Dire Avengers living for another round of shooting. Or oftentimes, because my Dire Avengers tend to be the last ones to die because the rest of the team is in the opponent's face with power swords, turning point 4, I might have like 1 or 2 Dire Avengers and 1 or 2 other models left on the board. Everything's already wounded, a lot of the opponent's team is dead, and it really comes down to those last couple resources, how you can protect them and how you can get the most out of them. So this can absolutely be the difference between one of those Dire Avengers making it through the end of the game. It can be the difference in points on the kill op. It can be the difference in your ability to score on the crit op or the tag op. So, yeah, be better than me. Remember that this one exists. And the last technique for Dire Avengers is Raging Heat of the Dying Flame. Use this aspect technique when a friendly Dire Avenger, during a friendly Dire Avenger operative's activation. Until the start of that operative's next activation, you can ignore any changes to its stats from being injured, including its weapons stats. Again, not very flashy. You'll find that a lot of the Striking Scorpion and Howling Banshee techniques are probably a little bit more exciting than these. And this is the one that I definitely use least, because oftentimes your Dire Avengers can be pretty safe in their shooting because of the extra APL. But sometimes at the end of the game, like I was talking about with Unstinting Immovable, you have very few resources left. If they were able to sneak in a couple shots and injure you, that difference to your move stat from being injured might be what the game hinges on, of your ability to just get onto a point and score. So, again, tuck that away in your brain. You probably won't use this very often, but it can be really important to keep in mind, especially towards the end of a very competitive game where you don't have many resources left. So, this one's going to be a pretty short video. Those are all 5 of the Dire Avenger techniques, and they're all pretty straightforward. Most of them have to do with shooting. 3 are just about performing shoot actions with shuriken weapons. One's against defending against shuriken attacks. And I think that they're really important to how the team functions, especially into certain matchups. There's a lot of talk about, Blades of Khaine struggling against elites, and that's fair. It's challenging. But your Dire Avenger's ability to chip things down, like I mentioned before, is really huge. Because a Howling Banshee charging into a Legionary with a Marcus Slanesh or just an Assault Intercessor, it's a pretty bad time. Like, unless they fail a bunch of their rolls, you'll hit them for a bunch, but they'll just kill you. And we can't afford to be making those trades. We just don't have enough models to do it. So you're really going to rely on the Dire Avengers spiking some damage through with that lethal 5-up and Ceaseless and Rending, or chipping away with with crack grenades or with other options and your shuriken pistols on your other models, before your melee threats can really start to take over a game in those tougher matchups. And when you're not dealing with those tougher matchups, Dire Avengers have a really good shooting profile for just killing things like a kind of guard equivalent body or 7 or 8 wound 4 or 5-up save models. They're pretty dang deadly into. You're basically just shooting a rending bolter at them, and as we know, Marines can just shoot those teams dead. So this one's a bit shorter. The ones on Howling Banshees and Striking Scorpions will be a little bit more in depth, and I'm filming some things with models set up to kind of better illustrate what's going on with certain techniques. But I hope this video has been useful, gives you something to think about, and if you're newer to the team, I hope it gets you up to speed on how to use Dire Avengers. I will see you in the next video soon. Bye.